Hey, it's Sam from Folk of All Trades here, and today we're going to be talking about how to make miso at home, your very own miso. This video is supported by Resilient South. That's the cities of Holdfast Bay, Onkaparinga, Mitcham and Marion. So big thanks to them for supporting us. Miso is obviously a fermented food, and I want to acknowledge that we're meeting here on Kaurna land. Danny and I live on beautiful Kaurna country down in Aldinga, and acknowledge Aboriginal Australians as the first fermenters. Not many people in Australia or elsewhere in the world know about that. It's a fascinating topic. I strongly recommend you having a bit of a research and check out some of the information around. So we're going to be talking about miso, which if you don't know miso, it's actually from Japan. There are soybean ferments from around the world, a beautiful one from Korea as well called donbang. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that very wrong. But we're talking about miso today. So that's basically fermented soybeans with koji rice. So it is gluten-free, and you actually get tamari out of it as well. So you might have seen soy sauce, not always gluten-free, but tamari is. So really, really easy ferment to make at home. You just have to be patient, and that's the hardest thing with this. So I'm going to teach you today about the ingredients that go into miso, but also the process and show you step by step. So hopefully you'll be able to have a go. Well, the main ingredient is soybeans. We've got some dried soybeans here. That is from 4-leaf milling. We like to get our soybeans as local as possible. They do beautiful organic stuff. So you can buy them in big paper bags as well, plastic free. So that's organic, local soybeans. If you can't get local or organic, do get the dried. You need to use dried soybeans for this recipe. Tinned won't really work that well. So, and it's much, much cheaper as well to get a big load of soybeans. You'll need 1 kilogram, so it's a reasonable amount. Now, the other main ingredient is koji, and koji is a whole topic on its own. It's absolutely incredible, this stuff. Basically, it's a fungus that's been grown on rice. So the fungus is called Aspergillus oryzae, and it really, really likes to live on rice. You can grow it on other things. I've tried to make it myself. You can make it at home, but again, that's another topic. You can also purchase it. So we bought this online through Rice Culture. So I know they make some, they're up in Queensland. There's also a crew down in Tassie, Meru Miso, that make it as well. And you'll need 500 grams finished koji. So this has been dehydrated. It's 400 grams, but I'm going to add 100 grams of water. And so that'll bring it up to 500 grams. So that's the koji. Incidentally, you can also use that to make things like amazake and soy sauce and sake even. So yeah, really cool product. And the final thing we need is salt. We need quite a lot of salt. If you've tasted miso straight, you know it's a pretty salty product. Part of that is because of its really, really long fermentation, but it's also used kind of like a seasoning, like a condiment. I actually use it in place of Vegemite. You know, I was getting sick and tired of buying Vegemite jars, and so now I spread miso on my toast in the morning. That's really delicious. So, how do we make miso? Well, I've started with my soybeans, 1 kilogram, and I soaked that overnight in heaps and heaps of water. So you don't just cover the soybeans, you actually need to massively increase the amount of water, more than double coverage, because they're going to expand more than double in volume. I'll just show you a cooked soybean. The size difference is quite enormous, maybe tripled or even quadrupled in size. And so I soaked those overnight, and then I cooked them this morning for probably around 2 hours. Now, I can't give you an exact cooking time. Basically, you want to make it so that they are squishable. I don't know if you can see that. It's squished in my hand, but it's still really firm. It's al dente, as the Italians would say. And that's what you're looking for. I've got my soybeans that are probably still pretty hot now, and I need to drain those off. And we're going to reserve the cooking liquid, or at least some of it, which is why I'm doing this into a bowl rather than just down into the sink. I don't need to be too worried about there being a bit of moisture left in the beans. And a kilogram of soybeans is quite a lot. That's enough to pour into there, and the rest can go into my mixing bowl that I'm going to be using. Still a few in there. I would say these are probably about 60 or 70 degrees, and we need to wait till they get a little bit colder. So I'll show you some of the other bits and pieces before we move on to the next step. Just put that up there. As I mentioned, I need to rehydrate my koji, and to do that I'm going to use 100 grams of water, which I've measured out here, and just pour that over the top of the koji. Now, koji is one of these things that it's best kept quite cool, under 15 degrees ideally. I've just kept it at room temperature since I got it, received it in the post. But if you're going to hold on to it for a while, probably better to keep it in the fridge just to maintain its freshness for as long as possible. So it's not much water, just enough to kind of wake those fungi up. Cool. So that is my reserved liquid, that is my beans, and that is my koji. That all needs to sit for a little while. While that's sitting and kind of cooling down, I can give it a stir every now and again just to keep it a bit cooler. I am going to salt my fermenting vessels. Because it's going to be sitting in there for a year, really, before I open it. You know, you can taste it before then, but ideally you leave it for a year. Salt is going to help preserve it, so not only is the bean mixture itself going to be salted, but I'm going to salt all of the surfaces, all of those areas where beans are going to be coming into contact with oxygen. Makes sense to give it a little bit of extra protection. I have got my favourite salt here. I talk about this all the time. This is from Mount Zero, so it's pink lake salt from over near the Grampians, across the border in Victoria. And I really prefer that to some of the imported salts. I'm not going to use it straight out of there because I've already measured out my salt. There's 250 grams here, and that's the total I need for this recipe. So the salting inside the jar, but also the salt that's going to be put into the soybeans. What I've found is if you slosh a bit of water around on the inside of your jar, so these jars are clean, I've just washed them, just regular dishes. We're doing wild fermentation today, which means that, you know, we're not dealing with chemical lab cultures or anything like that. We're dealing with wild fungi in this case, the koji, and as such, you don't need to sterilize things. Things need to be clean. You know, I washed my hands just before I started, so I'm just putting a bit of salt. I could probably do with a tiny bit more water. It's dried off a little bit. I'm just going to splosh a bit in. So hopefully that'll let the salt stick a little bit better on the inside surface. And I'm going to salt the rest of those. I've estimated that I'll probably need 4 of these approximately litre vessels, and you'll notice they're all these click top. I did use a crock, fermentation crock, the first time I made miso, but I found it was drying out quite quickly. Because it sits there for a year, it was quite a bit of effort to kind of top it up all the time, and I did have a reasonable amount of mould form on the top. Now, it's not the end of the world if you get some mould on the top. That will be oxygen-loving mould, and the rest of the miso should be fine, but I prefer to keep the mould out if I possibly can. So just using a vessel like this, which does have a really, really good click seal. You can buy these new from the shops and they'll come with a good seal. Otherwise, IKEA actually sell replacement seals. So if you find them in op shops, you know, we've got some beautiful old ones from France and things like that that we like to use. Just checking on the temperature of this. Now, koji will be damaged at above 40 degrees, sorry, above 60 degrees Celsius. So what I'm aiming for is around 40, 45 degrees. Now, I've got a little temperature sensor here. Basically, 60 degrees is kind of uncomfortably hot when you put your hand in. So I can hold it in there for a second, but then it, you know, starts to get a bit warm. The top is probably cool enough, but I need to just keep mixing this and let it cool down a bit more. So I'm going to let that happen and come back and join me in just a second for finishing off. Okay, our beans are now about 45-ish degrees, as is our reserving liquid. And I've measured out just 500 mils of that liquid that the beans were cooked in. And that's what we're gonna dissolve a fair bit of our salt into. So you remember I measured out 250 grams of salt. I'm gonna reserve some because I really wanna salt the tops of the jars quite heavily. And all of these, are pretty approximate measurements. The 1 kilo of beans and the 500 grams of koji. It's a bit of a ratio and you can play around a bit. So that's pretty well mixed in now, I think. And we're gonna do a lot more mixing in just a moment. That bean liquid and salt goes into our beans. It wasn't quite fully dissolved, but that's all right. And our koji goes in there as well. So our koji's plumped up a little bit. And as you can tell, you probably need quite a big bowl. My other really big bowl is in use for making bread at the moment. So you might need to even use a big pot is quite a good solution. And essentially now we want to mix all of this together really, really well. I was watching a video the other day that talked about Korean food and how they've actually got a word for hand flavor, which I thought was so cool. And it's the case in lots of fermented foods that we actually use our hands. Of course, you can wear gloves, if you've got sores or, some issue with your hands that mean you don't want to put them in salty beans, then by all means wear gloves. But I do like that there's this understanding that maybe there is some good stuff on our hands as well, some good bacteria, and of course the love and the intention that we put into the food too. That's getting nicely mixed, and really you could leave it quite chunky if you wanted to. It depends on how you want your final miso to be. The first miso I made was pretty chunky. I didn't do much bashing of the beans, and that can be really nice, particularly if you're spreading it on toast or something like that. It's quite easy to kind of bust up those bits of bean. But if you're putting it in miso soup or something where you actually want it to be incorporated completely, you can have these little beans floating around or sinking to the bottom. And so for that reason, it might be nice to have it a bit of a smoother texture. Now, I didn't talk too much about what the koji is actually doing and how it turns into miso. Basically, this fungus, this koji fungus, which they've known about in Japan for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is that it turns long-chain carbohydrates and proteins into the simple building blocks. So in the case of carbohydrates, it turns them into simpler sugars, breaks them down with an enzyme, and with proteins, it turns them into amino acids. And amino acids are basically the building blocks of protein, and they taste delicious. That's where the umami is coming from. So things like tomatoes and soy sauce, cheese and meat, they all contain amino acids, and that's why they have that really rich umami flavor. And the koji, is just fantastic at kind of bringing that out. That was in the soybean already, but is being released through those enzymes, through that breakdown. But it does take a very long time to do it at room temperature. You do want to ferment relatively cool. So if you choose a cool spot in your house, maybe in a pantry or in a room that doesn't get that western sun or sun from the north, that'll be the best spot, because you do need to leave it for quite some time, ideally in the dark. And that's just because a lot of bacteria and things like that, and in this case yeast, they don't like UV. It can be damaging to them. So I'm just going to keep bashing this. If you had a potato masher, you don't need to use a wooden, whatever this is called. We don't have a potato masher. This is what we use. So that's what I've chosen for today. But even a wine bottle, or if you've got a thick rolling pin, or you can even just use your hands. I'm going to keep going with this, and I'll get you to join me in just a second when they're ready to pack into the jars. Okay, that's been a few minutes of smushing now. Switch to the hands, because I found that was actually more effective. It's funny, because if you only make it once a year, you kind of forget these little tricks that you learn along the way. I do remember that some people use a meat grinder or something like that, though, to actually make a real puree. The gentleman I learnt from, a guy called Hiro from Western Australia. Yeah, he uses a meat grinder that he only uses for miso and manages to get incredibly smooth puree. So that's pretty good for my taste. There's a few whole beans in there, but mostly it's pretty pasty. We've actually got another one here. We split it into 2 bowls because it was just too big for one bowl, and that is much smoother. So you can do experiments. You can have one jar maybe that's super smooth and another one that's a bit chunky, and see what you prefer. But this one is ready now to put into a jar, and the outside of the jar is going to get messy. There's just no getting around that, so that's fine. One thing you want to really make sure when you're packing it into the jar is that you don't leave big air pockets, and I find the easiest way to ensure that is to just put in small bits at a time and actually smush it down as you go, and you can kind of have a look at the side and see, yeah, okay, I've left a little gap there, I need to use a bit more pressure, and just work your way around. This is probably about the right wetness, level of moisture. You don't want it to be really, really wet because it will release moisture over time. That's the tamari that I talked about. So that's a beautiful salty seasoning liquid that you may be able to take off. It'll form a layer on the top, and you can just sort of pour that off. You don't want your miso to be dry as a result, but sometimes if it's an extra amount of moisture at the beginning, you can get that secondary harvest, which is pretty cool. So that's getting pretty close. I do want to fill it up fairly well, just to reduce the amount of airspace and therefore oxygen. And as I was saying, if you do get some mold on the top, that's no big deal. Your body will tell you, and your senses will tell you if something's no good and it doesn't taste good. You've scraped off that level of that layer of mold and composted it. If it's gross and it really doesn't smell good compared to miso that you've had elsewhere, then unfortunately you may have to get rid of it. But it's very unlikely. We're using a good strong culture here of koji, and it should be fine. Okay, so that one's filled up pretty well to the top, and I'm just going to sprinkle a decent layer of salt on the top. So it's actually kind of caking the top layer. And so that's still from my original 250 grams. If you didn't have enough salt and you wanted to put a bit more on the top, that would be fine. So that's pretty well covered now. And just making sure that there's not a huge amount that's going to interfere on the rim or up along here in your seal, and I just close that off. Now, you'll read quite often that you need some kind of follower, is what it's called in fermentation, where you basically put something on the top, whether it's a scrubbed rock or a little piece of wood, something like that. I found that you don't actually need it, particularly if you fill it up right to the top. You're not using a crock where air might get in, and you're using a good seal like this. I haven't found it necessary. Baking paper or something like that, waxed paper you can put on the top just to reduce even more air contact. Up to you. You could maybe try some with, some without. It's just another step. So yeah, I avoid doing it. Now, I will continue to fill the other ones up, but you probably don't need to watch me do that. I want to talk just for a second about aging and storing miso, so join me back in just 1 second. I just want to give a shout out to Sandor Katz, who wrote this book, and that heavily influenced the recipe and process for this, and also Hiroshi Sugihara, who taught me and others how to make miso and koji at a workshop a few years ago. This is now ready for storage, and I've already labeled this one November 22. It can be really, really easy to mix them up in the future. You might think you'll remember, but just like with seeds or plants, labeling is always a good idea. So if you've done different treatments as well, like this one is the smooth version. So I'm just going to write smooth on there. You could write any kind of information you want. Maybe you extra salted or added different kinds of flavorings. Now, when you're storing these, as I said, best to put it away for a year. After a year or so, it will turn a little bit darker and start to develop those beautiful rich flavors. But if you can leave it even longer and that's the benefit of making a big batch, is maybe you start eating this one and it takes you a little while to get through it, and then you can start with this one, and eventually, you'll have a whole range of ages. This one, as I said, more than 2.5 years old now, and just so delicious. You can see that I've been taking out of the jar, and what I tend to do is scoop a reasonable amount out and pack it into another jar that I then keep in the fridge for easy use when I'm cooking or what have you. And then what's really important is just to make sure that's packed down really firmly. It's got a nice smooth top. You can give it a little bit extra salt on top if you're worried about mold starting to form. I found that when it's this kind of stage, the chemistry has already happened and it's pretty safe from spoilage by then. Stash it away. The best time to make miso is a year ago. Second best time is now. I really hope you'll have a go, and thanks for joining me.